Next on Rugby Wrap-Up, USA Rugby CEO Ross Young answers the tough questions surrounding bankruptcy, racism, and Rugby World Cup 2027. Rugby Wrap-Up brought to you in part by The Pig and Whistle, the world's best rugby pub. The Murphy Kennedy Group, founded with the idea that construction can be done better. And Lean and Limber, stretching your way to a healthier lifestyle. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Rugby Wrap-Up. Matt McCarthy in Midtown Manhattan talking rugby. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks to our guests today, Stephen Lewis from the Upper West Side and Mr. Ross Young, the CEO of USA Rugby, calling in from the Rockies in Colorado. Steve Lewis is still the reigning USA Rugby two-time Coach of the Year as per the COVID. He heads the Jamaica Sevens program, men and women. He is also the interim GM for Rugby United New York in Major League Rugby. But the big ticket item here is Mr. Ross Young, the CEO. Ross, welcome back to Rugby Wrap-Up.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we get into the specific questions, let me just briefly bring everybody up to speed on what happened in bankruptcy court. Here's what happened. The Rugby World Cup Sevens Championship in San Francisco had a series of cost overruns and revenue shortfalls, which resulted in World Rugby providing $4.4 million in unsecured financing. Simultaneously, USA Rugby faced a $40 million breach of contract suit initiated by United World Sports over the rights to sevens. It was the Vegas Sevens and then the LA Sevens. Men's 15s went $750,000 over budget preparing for the Rugby World Cup in Japan. Revenues from donations fell short by approximately 50%. The United World Sports suit, cost overruns, and the declined philanthropy had USA Rugby on the verge of insolvency. To remedy the situation, World Rugby supplied another $1 million to enable USA Rugby to stay open for biz. USA Rugby undertook major cost-cutting measures, including credit line freezes, layoffs, and reduced corporate travel. Assuming the productions in place on February 1st, 2020 had held, USA Rugby would have been able to operate only until May 2020. COVID-19 killed that. Dues revenue failed to materialize, and the May solvency timeline shortened to March. Thus, the bankruptcy filing. And I've got people asking me all the time why this continues to happen, because it's like Groundhog Day and deja vu all over again for a lot of the membership. And I happen to be a big Ross Young fan and always rooting for you, but I've got people asking me, how the heck does this guy got to have his job? And that's your first question, Ross.
Have I still got the job? No, I mean, we've talked at various times, Matt, on this show and at other times around the checkered history. The summary there, that you laid out, I think a lot of the component factors were sitting in the background, and we were always scrambling to try and get on the right side since I've been involved. And, I think everyone knows that history and won't go back through it. So, I've said before on a number of occasions that, there's certain things I wish I could change. There's certain things that are outside of my control. And the tailspin that we ended up going into on the back of COVID is we're still trying to right the ship. When I came on board, I said I wanted to see this through. Reorganization, restructuring was always part of that process. As you alluded to, we'd started that in December last year. Obviously not without COVID being factored into it in any way or form. And then a lot of that reorganization we've managed to accelerate through this process. So, I want to hang in there. Obviously, as everyone knows, it's been a complex environment. It's been difficult to unravel. I certainly have apologized and will continue to apologize for a couple of the errors that I made, but it shouldn't just be about me. It should be about collectively rugby getting back on its feet, and I want to do whatever I can within my power to get us with a clear runway and a foundation to be able to build the game on us that undoubtedly we all want to do.
All right, your Scottish counterpart has a couple of questions, but we've agreed that we're going to just keep it civil, so there's no Scottish on Scottish fighting here. All right, Stephen, you have a couple of questions for Mr. Young.
Sure. First off, good to see you, Ross. Looking well. I know you've had a rough go of it the last 6 months, so you put a lot of work in, and everyone does appreciate those efforts. But I think before we look to the future, we do have to acknowledge that past, just one little bit more with a couple of questions. The bankruptcy plan really takes care of and pays back, theoretically, the big boys. That's World Rugby and JP Morgan Chase, the two secured creditors. But it doesn't really help, or it doesn't help the USA Rugby members, your members, the little guys in particular, who pretty much got stiffed. So I just want to mention a couple of them here so people have an indication. There's about 280 people or organizations affected.
He's not going to name all of them.
No. Rugby Virginia, Sacred Heart Rugby, both of the big college organizations, CRA and NCR, owed money. Oak Park Elementary School District, Baker, Barrett and Isles, Sevens player, Courtyard by Marriott. There's a lot of people who got stiffed. And actually more of an opportunity than a question. What would you like to say to those members? Understanding the bankruptcy process, you have to take care of the big boys first, but what would you like to say to the USA Rugby members who feel still a bit bitter?
First of all, I want to apologise. The last thing we want to do is have any stakeholder be out of pocket as part of this process. It was not a situation we ever wanted to get into, which, a lot of the plans that we talked about and that Matt alluded to prior to COVID hitting, we wouldn't have been in that situation. We would have managed those small unsecured debtors, or smaller in comparison to, obviously, as you said, the big boys, in the right way. But the way the bankruptcy process works, we can't look after one without the other. There has to be parity in, when you list out all those creditors. So, of course, myself, the board and everyone else involved, apologize for putting people in that position. It's the last thing we wanted to do, but we didn't. If we were going to continue to survive and, as we talked about, try and get back to where we want to get to with the organization, we had to take that action, Steve.
Yeah. So moving on to the actual bankruptcy exit plan. Okay. So obviously you had to submit various figures, both to satisfy World Rugby, and also the bankruptcy judge had to sign off on it. And so looking at some of those projected revenue and income figures. So for instance, on membership dues, it's 600,000 in the month of September, which is about to finish. It drops down a little bit, and then you have another big spike in January. You're expecting 400,000. So between now and January, you are expecting, or you have represented you're expecting, about $1 million in membership dues. So two-part question, really. How realistic were those figures, given the current situation? And how are you sort of matching up now? How successful have you been in getting members to register?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as explained to the judge and the wider documentation, we're always had to be a degree of flexibility in whatever those figures were, because of the uncertainty of COVID and return to play. We've instigated or installed a new membership system, which has had its own teething troubles, but we're there now. So, I mean, we're only really began to actively drive and open registrations over the last couple of weeks. So, I mean, we're certainly not at the 600,000 mark. I think with all the budget and with that budget putting together, Steve, it was, that income, was leveled against what expenditure was going to be. There's certain things that we haven't had the ability to do because of COVID, likewise. So we're not going to spend money that we haven't got in the bank. We're just continuing to monitor it and ensure that the expenditure doesn't go beyond what's coming in. I think that 600,000 that was put in there, I'm still hopeful that we'll get near that. We haven't had that initial, for one of it's been used a number of terms, that spike that we would normally get in September, because the return to play has been much more gradual based on different regional criteria around COVID. So
you speak of the regional aspect of this, Ross. This is the Northeast. There's nothing going on.
Correct.
And players are being asked to pay their dues to play touch rugby, and they're saying, screw that. They're going to wait till March. So that would indicate that there's going to be an impact on that budget? And what's the contingency?
That budget, Matt, was not based on 100% of our members signing up. So that budget line was basically an aggregate of around 40% of what we would normally expect of active players. There's a reduced training membership that's available currently, or COVID training membership. For people that want to avail themselves of that, they're not going to be able to get into the full contact aspect of the sport. But there are other areas in the Midwest, for example, that are playing games this weekend. So, we were certainly aware that there wasn't just going to be nothing like a full-on return to play in September. It was always a conservative number based on around that 35% total membership returning to some form of play. As long as that happens before December, then we'll just continue to monitor that.
If it doesn't happen, because we are witnessing globally a second wave of the pandemic, with fans not being able to go to matches in Europe now, at least in the Premiership, and the difficulties around that. And what USA Rugby faces is a problem that none of these other nations face, in the sense that we are so large, and we also have issues politically on how to handle COVID and lockdowns, et cetera, in different states. And you're right under that umbrella. Unfortunately for you, you have 50 states, you have different situations basically in all 50, and yet your membership is in all those 50 states, and that's key revenue.
But we're no different, and that's the thing with it. Weekly calls with other NGBs as part of the USOPC Council. I mean, there are a lot of entities in a similar situation, and we just have to cut our cloth accordingly, Matt. There's no other way to look at it. Nobody has answers to those questions currently about when we're going to get back to normality, whether it's us, whether it's in the media, the issues someone like the RFU are facing, where a completely different set of dynamic. But a lot of what drives them is not membership fees; it's having fans in the stadium for, and they're looking to $240 million reduction in revenue if they get no fans in between now and spring next year. And that's what funds their community game. And they're having to scale back. We collectively have obviously had to release a number of staff members at various points during this process. All the existing staff members took significant pay cuts. Nobody's back up to 100% because all that's contingent on what the money that comes in the door.
You had that whopping pace. You had that whopping staff, and I think you're down to 8?
Outside of the HP, 8 full-time employees currently, yeah.
Yeah, so we're facing stark realities, and certainly this isn't your doing. COVID is not your doing, but you are going to be the one that has to deal with the realities that are in front of us. So I guess I'm just wondering, in a gloom and doom scenario, what the contingency plan is if we can't count on membership dues, and we're emerging out of bankruptcy court. Is there some kind of leniency? Is there some kind of forgiveness for USA Rugby under the circumstances of the pandemic?
Not from the bankruptcy perspective. I think we need to make sure that, to Steve's point earlier, that we, with regard to Chase Bank in particular, that big secured creditor, that we continue to make those payments. I think, forgiveness, returns, World Rugby, USOPC, their funding, additional fundings, as we know, and World Rugby have publicly stated they've had to support a number of unions to allow them to survive. I think there are always going to be avenues we're going to have to look at if we want the union to try and continue, or but all we can deal with what's in front of us, Matt, and it's horrible. Make no mistake about it.
Okay, so if we are in that place where we have that unfortunate situation, and I'm sorry I keep going back to this, but if the budget monies aren't there come March because of COVID, how will you keep the lights on? Will there be the philanthropic commitment, say, that we get for the Sevens program that might come from an organization like the Golden Eagles, for instance, that might help? Or you can't count on that either?
I don't think we can count on anything other than just, continuing to, to manage what we've got, and live within those means, and, look at the options in partnership with World Rugby about how we can just keep things going until we do come out the other side of it. And it's, that isn't going to be us, as we know, that from small businesses all the way through NGB, you're all going to have to look to some form of partnerships, ask forgiveness, to your point. I mean, we're in a position at the moment whereby we're obviously keeping outgoings to an absolute minimum to give ourselves some form of buffer. But ultimately, if the revenue doesn't come in, we're going to have to continue to cut our cloth accordingly.
I think the other issue for you, the question is, how do you deal with the sort of trust deficit? The USA Rugby brand has become something somewhat toxic publicly. And I think, without being too harsh, a lot of people look at it like an abusive relationship. All right, so here we go again. We finally got away, and, Dad's been to rehab. Now he's back. Can we trust him? How do you go about, philanthropic? I mean, that's all about trust as well. That's why those guys aren't keen to pony up. So how do you, in the midst of this difficult situation, sort of repair that sort of trust deficit? Or what can you do, or what are you trying to do to just to garner that goodwill again?
There has to come to a certain point whereby you have to look forward and not look back. Fully endorse what you're saying, that there are, and I'm sure there will continue to be, trust issues. But the reorganization, the strategic partnerships, the amalgamation of what was Congress into one representative entity with the various different community groups, the different councils that are out there, is just continue to be open with everyone about what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve, and getting out in front of it. With the help of EY last year, and we talked about it on a show, that there was lots of good work done on a broad strategic framework, but we never had the opportunity to.
That's Ernst & Young for people at home that.
Yeah, sorry, Ernst & Young. We have the framework there. We've got to put the business and operating plans, and we've got to do that in a proper stage way. And the federalisation, if you like, or decentralisation of some of the responsibilities into those councils will be beneficial for everyone. And let's make sure that governance is there. Let's make sure that training, education, compliance, and those other elements, are forefront and centre to everything we do, and deliver what we're supposed to, and be upfront with it. And that there's going to have to be a rebuilding phase. Speaking
to the governance end of it, I know that we're talking about decentralization, but we do have a special situation. We have this COVID thing. And getting back to what I was saying earlier about the difficulties of having 50 states and different GUs in different areas under different geopolitical climates, or whatever you want to call it. If there's going to be a return to play, USA Rugby says, okay, yeah, you're all from 50 states and different geographies and philosophies or whatever, but we're putting down a mandate that says X, Y, and Z for return to play, and this is how you return to play.
You cannot do anything that your state political jurisdiction does not allow. So that's it's not a USA Rugby thing. We are in New York. This is Rugby United New York. We're in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Fairly close rules, but different rules. It's not a USA Rugby thing. It's not our choice. It's strictly that local political jurisdiction.
I don't mean just ignoring what the government is saying and having rugby matches and gatherings.
Just admit it. It's a terrible question.
It was a terrible question. It was a good question in my head. It didn't come out right. But I'm getting emails already from old boys to play next month. And I'm looking at the email. I'm like, what are you talking about? This is what the mixed messaging is coming from. So I guess my question to you is, the mandate says, hey, no rugby until X, Y, and Z. And when X, Y, and Z are satisfied, then you do it this way.
Which is exactly what the COVID guidelines say, Matt. That there's tiered approach, there's stages, and as long as you comply with those, you're you're in line with what we're doing. But it's, we know the fact that everything, whether you have the anti-face mask brigade in certain parts of the country, you're going to have people that want to push boundaries in different areas. But ultimately, as an overarching NGB, we have to ask all our members to comply with the guidelines that are laid out there. And if you can do, there are lots of states and said that they're becoming that look as if they're becoming to come full online to be playing matches by complying with those criteria.
All right, guys, we have to take a quick break, but perhaps when we come back, we can actually talk about some positives. We'll be right back.
Been blind since I was 4, and I've never seen a beer commercial or a beer label. None of that stuff influences me. I drink beer because of the taste, and my beer is Pabst Blue Ribbon. It has the taste and the flavor.
What do you think's on the label?
I think there's a naked woman riding on a unicorn, jumping over fire. Oh, that's good beer.
If you're in New York City and want to watch some great rugby, have some great food, and some great times, go to the world's best rugby pub, the Pig and Whistle on West 36th Street. And we are back with the CEO of USA Rugby, Mr. Ross Young, and the champagne socialist that is Steve Lewis, who has a long resume, too long to list, coming back from our commercial break. But we promised to talk about some positive stuff, and we discussed off camera that Stephen would ask about the immediate and I would ask about the long term. And Stephen, why don't you go first?
Sure. So obviously part of the mission of USA Rugby, resuscitated USA Rugby, is to put our national teams, men and women, boys and girls, in the best position possible to go out and compete when there is competition. So could you tell us what the plans are for next year when, regarding, say, sevens and the World Series coming back, what the plans are for summer tests for men and women 15s? Obviously, we've got a Women's World Cup in New Zealand. So just maybe an overview of what's happening for national teams going forward.
Like everything, as we've talked about it, at various points during these discussions, there's still a degree of uncertainty that has to be with all the, but the principles for next year are obviously focused, to your point, Steve, on the Olympics and the World Cup in New Zealand, and therefore that has to be the immediate focus for preparation for those two events. As everyone's aware, World Rugby owns the calendar. The calendar for next year is under their control, and it's interesting. We talk about obviously issues from state to state within the US with domestic competition. I think World Rugby have that same conundrum with regard to different countries and different criteria in different countries, and especially an event like the World Sevens Series, it's probably the worst possible logistical event when you look at endangerment around COVID and COVID criteria, because of countries, players coming from countries all over the world and coming into one place and almost, commingling within team hotels and team rooms and eating rooms and then playing each other. So realistically, those conditions, those discussions are ongoing. I think we have regular weekly calls with World Rugby and their competitions department around the Sevens Series. Fortunately, we got Mike on the main working group that's looking at that as well. That's ensuring that there's at least a minimum number of games with the lead into the Olympics.
That's Mike Friday, coach of the men's sevens program that you're referring to.
Correct. Mike's part of that working group. There are talk about some sort of warm-up events in Europe, potentially at the end of the year, beginning of next year. But realistically, the idea is to kick off and have a minimum of 5 World Series type of events starting in March to give good competitive competition for the men and women leading into the Tokyo Olympics. So a lot of that is to be confirmed and part of ongoing discussions. And a tournament in LA is certainly in the mix to be part of those, one of those 5 events that lead up to those tournaments. Similar discussions around confirming the competition that was supposed to take place at the end of this year for the women's team, prior to New Zealand as well. And then currently the July window, as per the San Francisco Accord from years ago with various different games, is we're currently supposed to have England come to our shores in July. They'll play Canada 1 week, us another week. Obviously, if the Lions tour goes ahead, that will be a developmental England side, but still a great opportunity for us to have a run against them. And we've got to work through how we get our team prepared to play a team like England when they're not going to have played for almost a year before that. The MLR, obviously, regular discussions with them. They're having to delay the start of the season, as Steve knows, and how that ties into the international window as well. But at least we're going to have domestic players, hopefully, with some meaningful games under their belt and not going into it cold. So, I can't sit here and say these are going to be the games for next year, but certainly myself.
You don't have that COVID crystal ball handy.
Unfortunately not. But the broad criteria everyone's working for is ensuring there are those competitive games for those 2 major tournaments next year, and still working on the assumption that there will be some form of, there'll be the test match window in July, and then there'll be some form of America's Rugby Championship, once the MLR's finished its season in that August-September window. But all TBC at this stage.
A weakened England side coming over. Oh, I sense some fun and games with that on my part. But no, that's great. I appreciate the update.
So, okay, in a longer-term view, we've got chatter about the 15s Rugby World Cup coming here in as early as 2027 or in 2031. You've got MLR owners pushing for it. You, though, sir, are still probably pretty scarred from the Rugby World Cup Sevens, where you were charged with trying to make it work after it was already committed to. You've said on this program that you knew it wasn't financially viable, that it wasn't vetted properly. What is your take on 2027 for a Rugby World Cup in the United States and or 2031?
I'm not sure I said exactly those words around it, Matt, but I do agree with you that
I get paid to misquote.
The event, I came on board as a consultant from an operational perspective 6 months before that event, and obviously try to help Rosie with every aspect of it from that point onward. And it was clear there were some fundamental flaws on how it was constructed. And, are you going to dispute me saying right now that it was Will Chang who said, we're just going to do it, and forced it forward, and you guys were left to deal with the mess? Well, I think the fact that it was the way that certain elements were put in place at the time to safeguard any risk or loss, in retrospect, I would never have done it. I think to really lead into your point around the World Cup this time is, I think during the bidding phase for San Francisco, I reached out and offered to help when I was with Sir Evi Atavis at the time, not as a paid consultant by any stretch of the imagination, but just to be a stakeholder to help with that bid. That offer of help wasn't taken up at that time. But when you're going through a bidding process, the whole purpose of it is that, one, you do a feasibility. So can you physically hold it and operationally manage it? Then as you're going through the bidding stage, you use that as almost as a competitive environment to lock in the key costs for hosting an event. That wasn't done for the San Francisco event, which meant you're always playing catch up because you're no longer in a position of power as a negotiator or a host of an event. World Rugby went early on the back of Japan last year, which I applaud, to look at the next 2 World Cups as part of their combined overall strategy, so awarding 27 and 31 at the same time, which opens the door for a more non-traditional base, which is exactly what happened when I was involved back in when they awarded Japan and England at the same time. We have to have a fiduciary responsibility to at least explore it, because if we don't, and we don't get ourselves in any form or order, then 2731's gone. So it's at least another 20 years before we can host the thing.
Would USA Rugby benefit financially from plans that are being bantered about?
Ultimately, if we're hosted the event, then yes, we will.
I think there's quite an obvious understanding that World Rugby would not be bailing us out to the extent they're bailing us out if they didn't feel they could recoup their money. And I think a World Cup makes sense in that regard. So some of the skeptics might say that a Rugby World Cup in the US would be different from those that have been held before, in the sense that it would be more of a World Rugby private partnership USA Rugby event, so 3 partners, as opposed to the national union. So obviously, as part of a World Cup bid, you have to get government or sovereign guarantees, right, from the government, which is fine in France, the UK, or Australia, whatever. We're not going to get that. So those guarantees would have to be presumably private in nature. And what this tells me is, yes, we're going to get a World Cup. I'm all for it. But B, I'm not so convinced USA Rugby is going to benefit financially, even if they got it right. Do you have any thoughts on that?
The World Rugby's remit is to generate elements whereby the global game benefits. It's owned by the unions. I mean, the unions and the council, World Rugby is an entity and it has a duty of care around that growth. So, Steve, you're right, but every World Cup that I was involved with, and since then, the structure of it has always varied. As you say, a lot of it with physical government support, some of it self-funded, some of it insured, some of it in Japan with private equity as well as, because similar thing in Japan is you wouldn't get the same type of levels of direct government funding, going in as part of guarantees. So the SPV or the structure is important. I think from World Rugby's aspect, ultimately it has to be awarded to a host union, so we have to be in the middle of it. Otherwise, the hosting criteria just doesn't work. So, and it's our responsibility to ensure that we do get the relevant upside and legacy elements of hosting a World Cup as a host union.
Maybe we could have the Russians hack the process in our behalf and ensure that we get that vote for the Rugby World Cup here in the United States. But changing gears completely, the last 2 shows have been about racism in and out of rugby, and we've had 3 black women and 3 black men on. And I have to ask about the diversity that was brought up in the executive offices of USA Rugby, the administrative offices of USA Rugby, and ask you to address that.
I think D&I and D&I initiatives, and Fader will probably attest to it, that from something that we identified a couple of years ago improving. I mean, the DE&I committee was launched over a year ago in looking at initiatives of exactly how we can improve that. I think, fully supportive of, a number of the comments that people have made about ensuring that we do put systems, processes in place, recruitment criteria to improve that. And really that's, I think at the moment, around a number of the social dilemmas that are being magnified because the environment we're in has brought that, to the forefront more, which I think allows us to continue our focus on that. So, the purpose of having that committee in place, the TORs of that committee, is to really help us build out and drive policy to improve those criteria on all fronts, be it from a playing perspective, be it from a recruitment perspective, be it board representation and national office employees. It's, we want that group to drive that, and and the board's and myself been a supporter of that since it started.
On the pitch, I'm going to kind of combine what Derek Lipscomb, Nia Tapper, and Alicia Washington were talking about. That rugby, you just need a ball and a field and cleats. And for that reason, it should be a lot more accessible to a lot more kids, specifically kids of color, and how there seems to be just those folks reaching out to pull in, like Roots Rugby, for instance, formed to help bring in colored kids. Is there an initiative, something outside of an organization like Play Rugby USA, to start getting more kids of color involved in rugby?
I mean, you know, all of those work streams have to fall through as part of the forward strategic planning process, because, you know, undoubtedly the growth of the game in general needs to improve. And I think, you know, if you look at you look at demographics, you look at Bill, we want more participation in general. And I certainly agree the fact that it has, you know, your point, it's not just you just need some cleats and a ball and a field to play. I think it is a sport that we all revel in the fact it's for every shape, size. You know, there's a position for everyone. Therefore, you know, all the criteria points towards it being diverse in the way that it should be. So I think anything that drives participation, and everything we do should have a work stream attached to it that is targeted towards, you know, more people of color, more, you know, of the minority demographics. And the same thing, you know, you talk about, it's not just race, it's also gender. The girls rugby organization that got set up, we want overall participation and increase. And of course, we want to target as much diversity as we can within that recruitment process.
All right, guys, we are basically out of time. Stephen, do you have a final question for Ross?
Yeah, but very quickly on that topic, I think USA Rugby is no different from other organizations within rugby and society in general. Education, opportunity, but I think the key thing now is we've all talked the talk, we have to walk it. So I think that's the big message coming out. Final point for me, I just like to say hello to our colleague Alex Corbisiero and wish him all the best in his medical challenge. Thinking of you, pal. Go well.
You beat me to it. I have it highlighted right here. That was going to be my closing thought, but hey, we can always do it multiple times for the big fella.
I'd jump in on that front as well. I think it's, you know, that he's gone through some struggles and a roller coaster himself. And as we said at the start of the call, I think, you know, got to put all these things in perspective, and we're dealing with our own challenges as well with the sport, isn't it? So yeah, good on you, Corbs. Dig in there, mate.
And the fact that he's being a rock star and talking about it publicly, maybe helping people come out and deal with it, is he's a legend, and we're rooting for you, buddy. And finally, Ross, I need you to comment on something that has Dan Power basically distraught. And I don't know, Steve, if you're up to speed on this, but Carol Baskin eliminated Charles Oakley in Dancing with Stars. Do you have any comment, Ross? No comment. She's speechless, ladies and gentlemen.
I was going to try and sing that. What was it? That Tiger Feet or the Mud Sob. It was too late. I mean, you can't drop that on me and expect just the.
You don't want to disappear suddenly either.
No.
On some, all right. But on that note, I want to thank Mr. Ross Young, CEO of USA Rugby.
Bye, everyone.
Mr. Stephen Lewis. I'm Matt McCarthy from Midtown Manhattan, talking rugby, signing off.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Wasn't that bad, Rossi Poos, was it?